For the past few episodes, we've been joined by James Lindgren, author of Preserving Maritime America, a cultural history of the nation's great maritime museums. In his book, James looks at 6 maritime museums. We've discussed 3 of them so far. We've been at the Essex Peabody Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. We've been at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And we've been at Mystic Seaport. Today, we head down to the lower Chesapeake Bay, Newport News, Virginia to be specific, where we talk about the Mariners Museum, one of the hidden treasure troves of maritime cultural history in the nation. So join us on the NASO Video Podcast. The North American Society for Oceanic History was created by maritime scholars who met in 1971 at the University of Maine. They recognized that in North America there was no forum for maritime history or a society devoted to the study and promotion of maritime history. The aim of the original group of organizers was to create a diverse organization based initially on Canadian and American membership, which would gain the interest of others. Now there are members worldwide. And it is this diversity of membership that continues to make NASO a truly unique organization. 2020 marked the first year in recent memory that NASO was unable to meet, and therefore we bring historians, archaeologists, and students who are scheduled to present. All right, Jim, so we'll go to your 4th museum, which you look at, which is the Mariners Museum down in Newport News. And unabashedly, I will tell you that this is my favorite museum, but I think it's also the one that's probably the most precarious of the 6 you look at in here in terms of maybe its existence going in the future. I know Mariners Museum in Newport News isn't quite on the main streets of American towns. So I was wondering, I'm interested in your discussion about Mariners Museum.
Yeah, the Mariners Museum was actually the first museum that attracted my attention. And it's because I did my PhD in Williamsburg, Virginia, and just 25 miles south on the peninsula is Newport News and the Mariners Museum. But I was fascinated by the story of the Mariners and its connection to Newport News shipbuilding. The museum was established in 1930, so right in the aftermath of Mystic Seaport being founded, New York philanthropist Archer M. Huntington endowed this museum. He wanted to, again, advance his shipyard. In 1927, he had inherited Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock, which was the nation's largest military naval contractor at the time. Had grown by leaps and bounds under Homer Ferguson back in the World War II era, but the shipyard faced dire straits in the 1920s. As you know from U.S. history, in 1920, and the 1920s, there was a major move for disarmament to cut the costs of the military. And so the Washington Conference held in 1921-22 led to cuts in shipbuilding, cuts in fleet size. What occurred also after that were other conferences that looked at other types of ships. What also occurred in the 1920s was this attempt to somehow find normality, by returning America to kind of a domestic economy. Newport News Shipmill and Dry Dock, which was owned by the Huntington family, which was founded actually by Archer's stepfather, Collis Porter Huntington, Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock was facing financial dilemma. And so in 1927, when Archer inherited the company, what he realized there had to be an attempt to make America more ship-minded or sea-minded. Archer said sea-minded. Homer Ferguson, who was the president of Newport News Shipbuilding, said ship-minded. But they both had the same emphasis of trying to get Americans to appreciate how ships were so necessary for the economy and the defense of its economy on these global oceans. And so in 1930, Homer Ferguson became head of Archer Huntington's museum. Huntington had the money. He provided kind of limited leadership, But Homer Ferguson, who himself was a graduate of Annapolis, who was the head of this major shipbuilding corporation, Homer Ferguson was the man who pretty much engineered the growth of the museum. The museum opened 33. First, they went on a collecting binge, and you can see a lot of things they bought globally. One thing about the Depression is a lot of people were cash starved. They sold their family heirlooms. They sold what they could. And so it was a buyer's market. And so Huntington's buyers went to Europe, they went to the Caribbean, they went through New England, and they gathered a treasure trove. And so today, Mariners has got one of the best collections globally when it comes to artifacts. And that was largely through Huntington's wherewithal. He was a multi-millionaire, and he kind of financed this. In the 1930s, though, Homer Ferguson faced another crisis. And the crisis was, again, this attempt to somehow prevent another European war. A lot of us know about the neutrality legislation the United States began to pass in 35 and 36 and went on before World War II's breakout in 41. Homer Ferguson was also worried about the so-called Nye Commission. The Nye Commission began in 34, center stage in 1935, again, front page news every day. Its findings were released in 36. And the Nye Commission tried to, again, emphasize how arms contractors had fueled the race for World War I, how arms contractors made a windfall of profits as American men, sailors, soldiers, and Marines would ultimately die. And so the Nye Commission led to this mark against arms contractors. And Homer Ferguson realized he had to tell a better story. And so the Mariners Museum, again, would redouble its efforts in the later 30s. Exactly the same time in England, the English, elite are establishing the Museum of Greenwich. The National Maritime Museum in England is also a kind of a product of this same attempt to return the nation, whether America or England, to its sea roots and to tell that story, sell that story better. So in the late 1930s, what we have is, as America hears the story of how the nation had to defend its ships across the globe, how the nation had to, again, make sure that this trade across the globe would prevail so as to prevent, again, downturn in the economy. What we have is the Mariners Museum telling that story through artifacts, through publications, through its growth. Now, the Mariners Museum obviously is going to have to take second or back burner status with the outbreak of World War II. The war broke out in 39. The United States entered it with Pearl Harbor in December of 41. But what happened was the Mariners Museum would act really as a surrogate for Newport News shipbuilding and dry dock. You think of what won the United States World War II, particularly the Pacific, it's aircraft carriers. And Newport News was one of the main creators of those. Newport News and a subsidiary down in North Carolina would crank out ships. And these ships were not only battleships and aircraft carriers, they were, again, the typical Liberty ship. These craft that carried cargo across the oceans, whether to Europe or to the Pacific, to help the United States advance the war against its enemy. And so while Newport News shipbuilding and dry dock was known for providing the ships necessary to win the war, the Mariners Museum told that story evidently. Okay. Now, Mariners Museum is funded, as I mentioned, by Huntington. He essentially sold the yard back in 1940, his shipyard. He kind of pulled out of funding the Mariners Museum, but he left an endowment based on West Virginia coal royalties. And that would provide a steady stream of money all the way up until the turn of the 21st century, when first years of the 21st century. So Mariners Museum had this luxury of money coming in, but also had the fact that it had relied too much on that. Huntington had forbade it to ask for admission fees, had forbade it to, again, accept bequests. And so what we have is the Mariners Museum is in a financial precarious setting as the nation expands in the 1970s, 1980s. Now, Mariners is facing a couple of different local threats too. First of all, right south of Newport News is Norfolk, Virginia, right across Hampton Roads. Norfolk and Newport News are geographically close, but culturally very distant. Newport News, conservative. Norfolk, more entrepreneurial. Norfolk opens, again, a festival marketplace, James Rouse's Festival Marketplace in the 1980s. And it opens also a quasi-maritime museum to go along with that. And so what we have is Norfolk's, again, enterprise is competing against Mariners Museum. At the same time, the Mariners Museum is unable to provide financially for the necessary expansion of its facilities. Anybody familiar with Tidewater, Virginia knows that you have to deal with heat, humidity. And so to get up to professional standards required by the American Association of Museums, you had to have HVAC equipped facilities, heating, ventilation, air conditioning. And so costs like that would be on the rise. Mariners Museum was also forced to professionalize its interpretation. And so Mariners Museum is going through a financial crisis in the 90s particularly. And it's because the endowment was running out. It's because the costs were increasing. And it's because its ambitions had to kind of match the increasing ones of the profession itself. Mariners turned to some interesting attempts. John Hightower came in as president in the 1990s. John Hightower had been, again, at one time president of South Street Seaport. John Hightower had been an entrepreneurial type of museum director. And he turned to an attempt to bring in blockbuster exhibits. The Titanic is one great example. And I include a photo display of that in the book itself. The Titanic exhibit, like other blockbusters, was a real draw, but it just didn't maintain the momentum necessary to, again, match the necessary economic demands. And so Hightower is going to then roll the dice. And the dice he rolled was helped by the fact that Virginia had very good congressional ties. Virginia's congressional delegation, particularly the congressmen from the peninsula. The peninsula is Newport News, Hampton, and so forth. These men, and they were men, had been placed on key congressional committees. And the congressional committees would be ones in charge of appropriations. And so one of the committees is going to generate the opportunity for the Mariner Museum, along with South Street Seaport, to designate itself as America's National Maritime Museum. Now, this created an uproar in the Council of American Maritime Museums. How could Mariners Museum and South Street Seaport claim to be America's Maritime Museum? Congress had delegated it as such. But the real win that Hightower got was the contract to, again, outfit a wing to display the remnants of USS Monitor. Again, the Battle of 1862 in Hampton Roads between the Merrimack and the Monitor. The Merrimack became Confederate ship Virginia, battling this new creation of John Erickson, the Monitor. Again, the Monitor was a scientific marvel of its day. Again, with the patentable inventions that were undertaken within its its iron hull. This famous battle of 1862 is going to, in many ways, make Virginia's Confederate history. And John Hightower realized that, again, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, was looking for a place to display the archaeological remnants. Off of the North Carolina coast, again, there was a preserve where where a monitor had sunk, and NOAA was afraid that there would be scuba divers and explorers compromising the wreckage. And so, again, NOAA began and Congress authorized pulling up parts of Monitor. And NOAA needed a place where those materials could be conserved and displayed. And NOAA and Congress turned to the Mariners Museum. So a brand new wing was developed at the Mariners Museum, and it today shows the remnants of the Monitor, plus a recreation that was built by Newport News Shipping and Dry Dock employees, funded partly by the U.S. Navy, but a reconstruction of the ship that shows in some ways this vessel that had made Virginia so important in naval history and naval technology. Now, I should mention the irony. You got to remember, Virginia had seceded, had split from the nation. Virginia, even in the 60s, 70s, was kind of a mixed mind about the Civil War. The Civil War centennial of the 1960s brought in huge crowds to Mariners Museum, but a lot of these folks were neo-Confederates. They were fighting against civil rights advocates. They were, again, fighting against Washington's increasing power. And so when you think about the Monitor, it represented a ship of the North, the winning side, a ship that had defeated the Confederacy. And so there's going to be a mixed mind on the part of, again, Virginia diehards about showing this vessel. But it was such, again, a feather in the Mariners Museum hat that was hard to deny its importance. Now, John Hightower had hoped that the designation of the museum as America's National Maritime Museum, that the acquisition of the Monitor's remnants would somehow parlay themselves into financial success. It just didn't happen. Now, this is a story in and of itself. Why are Virginians unwilling, unable to keep Mariners Museum afloat? It's partly because there's so many other attractions in the Tidewater area. It's partly because in some ways the Mariners Museum had to compete against other attractions at Langley Air Force Base and at Southside Norfolk. But the point was that Mariners Museum faced financial hardship in the first years of the 21st century. And that financial hardship is, as I mentioned, because Huntington's endowment had expired, because the revenue coming in didn't match the expenditures that were necessary to keep the museum modern and afloat. And so the Mariners Museum is going to experiment with, again, various devices. Most recently, what it has tried, and this is an amazing attempt, is cutting its admission charge to $1. Now, when you think of like Mystic Seaport, I think it costs $28 or so to get into Mystic Seaport. Other museums, not so expensive, but pretty high. $1 to get into the Mariners Museum. And the attempt here is to try and get the public, the local public, more behind the museum. It's a noble cause, and it's well worth the effort, and it's still an experiment, still in the making. So the Mariners Museum began with the benefit in 1930 of Huntington's millions, but it had relied too much on those millions and had never been able to find an equal number of resources to replace Huntington's wealth once that had passed. The dollar membership today and Mariners Museum's emphasis on what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, the fact that even today Newport News Shipping and Dry Dock though it's gone through many different names, is the nation's #1 naval contractor. It's still the only one building aircrafts. It's still, along with Electric Boat up in Groton, the only one building submarines. The fact that Newport News is still, again, this major military provider is what is again, part of Mariners Museum attempt to establish a better constituency. So I like to emphasize the Mariners Museum because it recognizes it's got to change. It's also got to find a younger viewership. Sal mentioned the fact that in 2010, no, actually it was later than that, when you mentioned when the North Atlantic Society held its meeting in New Bedford, New Bedford was able to accommodate attendees because it had, again, a nice auditorium. Mariners Museum doesn't have that, but it recognizes that it's got to reach out to people. And the dollar membership and other attempts to, again, broaden its reach are examples of how museums, maritime museums in general, must be able to expand to find a newer clientele, a newer paying membership.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, Jim. I'm a kid in a candy store when it comes to the Mariners Museum. The model hall is one of my favorite places in the world to be, and the conservation that they're doing with Monitor is fantastic. We had Tane Casserly, who's with NOAA Marine Sanctuary for the Monitor, on, and they're talking about the expansion of the sanctuary to include the World War II battlefields and World War I battlefields off the coast. And I think that'd be such a great opportunity for the Mariners Museum to embrace, something akin to what Mystic does with their maritime history, could be something that's done with as you said, the military industrial complex of shipbuilding at Mariners Museum. But you're right, they do have one fault, and that is that ability to really put a large group together and do an auditorium, a conference style. I think they'd be fantastic for them to be able to do that. It is such a treasure, and again, it's the one place I worry about in your group, because it has such a wealth of information and just untapped in many ways. In our penultimate episode with James Lindgren, we head to the Barbary Coast. No, not the seedy shores of North Africa with pirates and corsairs, but we head to the west coast of the United States, specifically San Francisco, where we look at the San Francisco waterfront, museums, and maritime history. So join us on the next NASO video podcast.